This character just has so many funny, ridiculous thoughts. Did you like it? Did you hate it? What do you think happened to Franny? Who do you think wrote the threats? Tell me, I want to know, okay? There's quite literally no one asking me to do this, but this is a book that I don't think enough people are talking about or even know about, so I think you should read it. The synopsis of the book is that David's wife is dead. At least he thinks she's dead, but he doesn't understand why she had to go away, why this happened to her, how this happened to her. And if you're kind of confused about how vague that synopsis is, it's because that's kind of just how the whole book goes. I know you're waiting in suspense, but the book that I'm talking about is Threats by Amelia Gray, and I think you should read it. David's wife dies at the very beginning of the book, and then basically the whole rest of the book is David trying to make sense of what is happening or what happened, and the whole time, as the reader, you really are questioning reality. What happened to his wife? Is this guy okay? Just what is going on is the general question I had throughout this whole book, but it was just such a joy and I had such a great time with this book. As the novel progresses, David finds these written threats all over his house, and some of them are found by other people and given to him. He thinks that they're clues to try and figure out what happened to his wife, Franny. There's also some police characters who are also trying to figure out what happened. Obviously, David being the husband is suspect number one, so this whole novel is really following a tight-knit group of characters as they make sense or try to make sense of what happened. So who is this book for? Who am I recommending this book to? Because I don't think that this book is going to be for everyone, but I think that this book is for people who like literary novels, especially literary horror or literary thrillers. I would say if you also like themes of exploring grief versus insanity, a narrator that makes you question reality, an unreliable narrator. It's not so much horror, and it's really not a traditional thriller, but it just has so many parts that are unnerving. And yeah, it's really hard to explain. If you don't mind an ambiguous ending, if you are a language-driven reader or, are content with just reading really great writing, I think that this is a story that you should check out. This was just such a weird reading experience. If you like reading weird stuff, it was just so genre-defying for me that really made me enjoy it quite a bit. I actually reread this, so my original read of the book was listening to the audiobook, which was amazing. So if you are an audiobook person and you enjoy those, you could check out the audiobook, but I had just as much fun with my reread of the physical copy. And I think it was fun because I very heavily annotated it, and even while I was listening to the audiobook before it was over, I was like, I knew I wanted to go back and reread a physical copy because I was just so struck by so many parts and so many pieces of the language that I knew I wanted to have a physical copy with those places marked. So when I read this book, when I listened to it initially, I was very unnerved by a lot of it, but then on my reread, it was still unnerving, but there were actually a lot of parts where I thought that the writing was really funny. And after I read this book, I immediately tried to go find, interviews with the author, and she made the comment that a lot of readers have come up to her and said, it's so funny, like unexpectedly funny. And she was kind of puzzled by that because she didn't think that any of her writing in this book was funny at all, but I really did. So I guess there's just like a couple parts I want to point out. Yeah, were just funny, I thought. So yeah, David finds these threats all over his house and in like really weird places. Like he sees like his wallpaper starting to peel away, and he finds one behind it, the peeling wallpaper. He finds one in some of his wife's like facial creams and stuff. And after he finds the threat, it says, David considered the possibility that the threat had been included with the product from the manufacturer as a way to distract women from the amount of money they were spending on mineral oil and pencil shavings. And like, that's just this character just has so many funny, like ridiculous thoughts, and they do just come off as so ridiculous. And in the context of this book, it's just such a surreal experience. So I would say if any of what I just said is intriguing to you, this is probably a book for you and you should check it out. But I really want more people to read this so I can discuss what the heck I just read. Okay, so now on to who I think shouldn't read this book. I mean, obviously, if you are even a little bit curious, I think you should read it, but I don't want to like set you up for failure or set you up to read a book that you kind of already know you wouldn't like. So again, if you don't like ambiguous endings, I wouldn't read this book. If you are going into this wanting a thriller where it's like, this isn't like a Gone Girl. This isn't like a typical contemporary thriller. It is very literary and very surreal. It's more so like a character study of David, of the husband, because he's the main narrator throughout the whole thing. I would also maybe say if you are a really plot-driven reader, you would maybe have a harder time with this because it does kind of take its time. I mean, there's one whole chapter where it's devoted to just explaining dental processes, like cleaning teeth, because David was a dentist. So while the language it's like very beautifully written, if that's not something that's normally your cup of tea, I would maybe stay away from this one. So as I mentioned, it's a pretty tight-knit group of characters in this book. It's a language and character-driven story, I would say. In the beginning, when you are, you're mainly from the point of view of David. And of course, the wife dies, so you think, okay, David's suspect number one. And then he immediately starts to behave really oddly. And a lot of his behavior at the beginning, I think, could be attributed to grief. But then it really starts to cross into insanity. So then there's this whole exploration of grief versus insanity and kind of like the blurring of the two and how grief can look and feel like you're going insane, and you can look insane to other people because you're grieving and you just don't know how to act. So now I am going to deep dive a little bit more into David. So I would say if you do want to read this book and you don't want spoilers, and if you're interested in the annotated flip through, you can just skip ahead to that. But for the rest of this, I will say probably spoiler warning to anyone who wants to read this book. I think David was such an interesting character. And at the beginning, it was like, okay, David is maybe insane. But the other characters seem, they seem like they are acting normal. But then as the story progresses, I felt like, oh, wait, I think everyone is insane. And, even when it switched perspectives to other people and sort of like the way that they were conveying the story was so unreliable, and just the things that they focused on. And yeah, the way it was conveyed was just so like, who is the adult here? Everyone was just going off the rails, but I just kind of let myself be taken on that ride. And I really, really enjoyed it. So I do want to dive a little bit more into David's character because he is obviously the main character, and he's the one that we are seeing the story from the point of view of for the majority, almost all of it. And he is a really interesting character because while at the beginning you're immediately like, yep, you probably did it, you probably killed your wife, as the story progresses, I really started to like David and I really started to feel bad for him. He was just so actually confused about what happened to his wife, and he just really missed her, and he just seemed really sad and meek. But at the beginning, it's very clear that David has no friends. The friends that he refers to, he refers to them as Samson and the one that I can't ever remember his name. And the only time he ever sees them is when they come in and get their teeth cleaned from him every year. And then the one time they meet with him in real life in the book, he has to literally bribe them with money. So David has no friends. They were acquaintances at best. His mother is mentally ill, and she actually murdered his sister when they were children, and she now lives in a mental institution. And David's dental license was revoked because of a malpractice suit. David explains that he began to see worms in people's teeth, and I'm pretty sure that's a clear, hallucination. There are parts of the book where it's like, okay, that could be grief or like, mental illness. But then there are parts where it's like, this has to be a hallucination. So I'm assuming him hallucinating, worms inside people's mouths when he worked on them was a hallucination. And it comes to a point where he takes on a pediatric patient, and then he does what he believes to be the correct procedure for that, and then he ends up getting sued and his license gets revoked. And I think this kind of ties into this theme that comes up of David's, I think, ego coming through. He has this idea that the kindest thing you could do to someone is to change them for the better without them knowing, and without their consent. So there are these undercurrents of David where his ego comes to the surface. And I think the case where his license gets revoked is one of those instances. So there's one part where David says that they could come in unknowing and leave unknowingly improved. It seemed a kindness to improve upon an individual without his knowledge. And that's him referring to, he wished that he could just give people fillings without having to tell them they had cavities, because then they wouldn't have to know that they had a cavity, and then they could just leave unknowingly improved. And then when he describes his pediatric patient, first of all, he mentions that he is not a pediatric dentist and he doesn't have those qualifications, but there is not a pediatric dentist in town. So rather than referring the infant to a pediatric dentist, he just did it himself. And then, yeah, he describes that as he was doing the procedure on the infant, he knew that this would not be the last he heard from her being the mother of the infant, that his close attention, his kindness and care would be repaid with betrayal. So again, this idea of unknowingly changing someone for the better being a kindness, he's doing a kindness, and even though it's maybe not the best thing for the patient, because he thinks it is, it's like him doing the kindest thing he can do. And then sort of the last instance where this comes to a head, I think, is it's like this whole paragraph about him eating this pear. He's eating the pear, which is objectively bad for the pear because then the pear is no longer existing. But then he says, when his maxillary incisors pierced the skin, which first protected the fruit as it had against rain and sun, and then yielded to the invasion, he was oxygenating particles that had never even been open to oxygen. The wet fruit and seeds had existed in darkness for their entire lives until he tore them out with his teeth. When I read this, it really evoked this idea of, can violence change someone for the better or change something for the better? And I think it is tied to that idea of David thinking that changing someone, what he thinks is for the better without their knowledge, is the best kindness he can do to someone. And then I think with the fruit, that's obviously a really violent thing, to be eating something and consuming it, and it's making it so that it no longer exists. But he somehow deludes himself into thinking that into a positive, oh, this fruit has never existed like this. The inside of this fruit has been in darkness its whole life, and I'm the one bringing it to light. It comes off as very delusional to me. There are only a few glimmers in the novel of David seeming to be, like I said, that ego coming through and David being capable of violence. Although in the book, he's never actually violent. There's almost no violence in this book. And it's just the suggestion of it, the suggestion of David's possible capacity for it. So then, this really begs the question then, is David grieving or insane or both? And obviously, I don't think it's so black and white, but I would say on the insanity side or, mental illness side, as I mentioned, David seems like he is capable of violence, though he never actually presents it to us as the reader. He does seem delusional, paranoid, he hallucinates. He often discusses hearing buzzing. I'm not a mental health professional, but those definitely seem like symptoms of an undiagnosed mental illness. However, there are instances where I think it could be attributed to grief. There are certain moments where David realizes when he's among other people, he realizes he needs to act a certain way, or, it'll just be inconvenient for him. And it's not I don't think it's a psychopath thing or, he's unable to feel. It's just that he realizes that he's not doing well, but he wants to just act like everything is normal. The rigmarole of having to discuss it even further with these near strangers is more work than he wants to do. So there are glimmers where he seems to be coherent and he knows okay, I need to just get through this conversation and try to act normally, which to me indicates maybe it's a more grief thing. And then, as I said, the rest of the characters, as you get to know them more and more, they seem kind of insane and unreliable too. So then it's if that's just the baseline of everyone, then David isn't any more insane than the rest of these people, you know what I mean? And one part that I talked about, because I read this in January for my January wrap-up. Was it January? No, February. I read this in February and I discussed this a little bit in my February wrap-up. There's several chapters where the whole chapter is just David listening to a voicemail from Franny that he has saved from his wife. He just listens to it on repeat. And I just think that was such a clever way to tease that grief versus insanity, explore that even more, because there could be a few different interpretations of that behavior, of listening to the voicemails on repeat. Obviously, grief. If you're missing someone and you can hear their voice after they're gone, he misses his wife, he wants to hear her voice. I get that. But then there's also the possibility that maybe he's feeling guilty. If he killed his wife, he's maybe just kind of wanting to wallow in that even more. I killed my wife and hearing her voice makes me regret it, but I deserve this. I deserve to be in pain, And then I think the third is just paranoia. He's not well. The more he listens to it, it's almost like he's straining to hear differences in the voicemail. And I kind of mentioned this when I listened to the audiobook. They clearly had the woman that they hired to be the narrator repeat the voicemail. They didn't just record it once and then like replay it. They had her re-record it because it does sound a little different every time. So then that really made me feel more connected to David because it made me feel paranoid. I was like, wait, is it a little different? Was she saying it a little differently? Is that her, you know? And then I was able to sort of like get in his head a little bit, and I could see how, from a paranoia point of view, he was maybe listening because he thought that it was an imposter or it wasn't really his wife. So I was really fascinated by the exploration of grief versus insanity and sort of the blurring of that line. So then, you know, I guess the big question of this book is what happened to Franny? The novel pretty much starts out with her dying, and we don't really get an answer of what happened to Franny. You know, there are obviously clues and hints what possibly happened, but I think arguments could be made for either one. So rather than sitting here and telling you this is exactly what happened, I'm just going to tell you what I think happened. And, you know, if you've read this and you have different interpretations or I missed something, definitely let me know in the comments, because this is a book I really, really want to discuss further. So we know the cause of death was her leg got cut when she was back out behind the house in the woods. It's made pretty clear in the beginning that the woods are a place that Franny goes when she wants to be alone. David has only followed her there once, and he learned from her that he was not welcome there, so he claims that he never returned there. So she returns from the woods, as you know she normally does, and he realizes that she's bleeding, and basically they sit on the stairs together and she bleeds out and she dies. While it is possible that David did go out into the woods and slice her up somehow and then get back to the house before her, and he just forgot or maybe somehow repressed the memory or whatever, maybe he just didn't want to tell us as the reader. But I don't think David killed his wife, and I actually think that Franny committed suicide. David mentions that he really admires this Saint Apollonia, and in the year 249 she had every single one of her teeth bashed in, and then she was supposed to be burned at the stake, but instead launched herself into the fire. And because of her suicidal action and her martyrdom, she was made a saint. And the classical image of Apollonia was of a beautiful woman holding antique extractors in which a tooth was delicately grasped. It's mentioned very early on that David has a high reverence for this saint. And then there is this, you know, sort of climactic scene when David is in the laundromat where he hallucinates Franny bleeding, you know, standing in the laundromat holding a gold tooth extractor with a tooth in it. So a clear, you know, parallel to Saint Apollonia, and to me, a clear hint that Franny did in fact sacrifice herself or kill herself. It's mentioned that Franny takes medication for some affliction, but while it's not explicitly said that it's depression, it is a possibility. There are also hints of unhappiness in the marriage. As David explains the marriage, it becomes pretty clear that he wasn't maybe the best husband. I don't think he like went out and was cheating, and he didn't abuse her or anything that we know of, but it just seemed like he was maybe neglectful of marriage. He touches on the subject of children really briefly, and when I first read it, I was like, okay, they decided to not have kids, but then on my reread, I realized that it says, the question of having children was resolved by the presence of David's father, a strange older child with his stubbed toes and occasional tears and oversized diapers. So they were forced, basically for financial reasons and then because of the health concerns of David's father, to move in with David's father and take care of him. And that sort of got in the way of having kids. So it's not explicitly mentioned that they made the conscious decision to not have kids. It's just that they didn't. And then there's some baby imagery at the end of the novel. There's mention of David and Franny both stopped wearing their wedding rings, and it wasn't like a conscious decision like, oh, I don't like this marriage anymore. It just kind of happened. And then they're lost for years and years. And then at the end of the novel, they're found tied up together in a baby bonnet. So it's possible that Franny was unhappy in the marriage, not managing depression well. Her life had not gone how she had maybe hoped, or she had regrets about how her life had gone. And then with the Saint Apollonia imagery, it seems to me most likely that Franny did kill herself. But yeah, this book was a wild ride. This one kind of took me by surprise. So I'm really glad I picked this one up. I love Amelia Gray's writing. I loved the genre-defying aspect of this story. I love the language, I love the characters, and probably gonna be in my top books of 2022. If you have read it, let me know what you thought. Did you like it? Did you hate it? Did you think David killed his wife? What do you think happened to Franny? Who do you think wrote the threats? Tell me, I want to know, okay? Okay, let's do the annotated flip through for people who care about what I put tabs by. Okay, so this was the first book I annotated, so I wasn't really sure exactly what I was doing, but I knew I for sure wanted to label the threats since there was, you know, so many of them and they were so important to the story. So all the yellow tabs are the threats. Purple are spots where the language particularly struck me. And then pink was all the funny parts, which I know I said it's not supposed to be a funny book, but there were so many parts where I did laugh quite a bit. Blue is sort of like character development, or when I got more information about relationships, and specifically David and Franny's relationship. And then these purple tabs on top are favorite chapters. And then I didn't mark it here, but the red flags were just all spots where I wanted to talk about stuff in the video. And also sorry for my gross nail. I slammed it in a door like a couple months ago and it's still like not better. So sorry it's gross, but I gotta flip with my right. So we're just gonna flip through and take a look at everything I annotated. So I did use pencil because it just felt a little less desecratory, but I know some people use like pens with like, you know, that are color coded to the tab color. So I might try to do that in the future, but I also was like having a hard time because these pages were pretty thin. So I didn't want them to bleed through. But yeah, I like to underline. I rarely highlight things unless it's like a really key, you know, piece of language, because yeah, underlining to me just seems like enough of it draws your attention to it enough without kind of overpowering the page. I also felt, since this was my first time annotating, like I was doing it wrong, but I would say if you're interested or you're like wanting to annotate one of your favorite books, to just go for it. And one of my main concerns was that I was like putting too many tabs on, and I was like, there's too many parts that I'm wanting to annotate. So then is it sort of like diminishing the act of annotating when I'm just marking everything? But for me, it was like, you know what? This is my book. These are parts I like. Like, just have fun with it. If it's enhancing your experience more, then I say just go for it. And this definitely did enhance my experience. It made me feel a lot closer to the text, and it sort of enhanced my understanding, and it really made me look at the novel in a different way. I did get to a point where I sort of realized, like, okay, I think this is a part where I want to underline it, but it maybe doesn't need a sticky tab, or, you know, this needs an underline and a sticky tab. So I think just go with whatever you're feeling and just have fun with it. It was pretty rare for there to be a page without any marking on it, because there was just so much that, yeah, just really stood out to me. I kind of knew when I was rereading this too that I wanted to do a review video as well, so that kind of helped guide my annotating a little bit as well. But I'm obviously still learning, and if you have any annotating tips, I will gladly listen to them, so let me know. So this is one spot where I did highlight one of few. Basically the last chapter, the last like couple paragraphs, I underlined like everything, and I underlined a lot of that in pen. It was just so beautiful. I forgot to film an outro, so read this book. Read this book because it's good. Okay, bye.